In this demonstration, we're going to talk about using Remote Desktop. Remote Desktop is a really useful tool. Basically, it allows you to connect to a remote computer and use its desktop as if you were sitting in front of it. This can be very useful for a networking professional. It lets you troubleshoot problems on remote computer systems without being physically present. Now, in order to do this, first we have to configure Windows to allow remote desktop connections. We're going to work with two different Windows systems in this demonstration. This is a Windows 10 desktop system. This is where we're going to enable remote desktop connections. I also have a second Windows 10 system that we're going to initiate a remote desktop connection from. This is the system I normally sit in front of. So let's go ahead and enable remote desktop connections on this remote system. In order to do this, I can select Start, scroll down to Windows System, and select Control Panel. From there, we go to System and Security, then to System, and we want to click this option right here, Remote Settings. As you can see, currently, remote desktop connections aren't allowed. Let's go ahead and turn on the option. There are basically two different levels of remote desktop access you can enable. By default, if we just mark Allow Remote Connections to this computer, we allow pretty much any operating system that supports remote desktop connections. If we want to increase the security a little bit, we can mark this option to allow connections only from computers running remote desktop with network level authentication. And as you can see, this is the recommended option. Now, once we've done this, we also have to specify which users on the system are going to be allowed to connect. So we need to come down here and select Users, and then we need to add any users' accounts that we want people to be able to remotely log into this system as. There's an important thing that you need to remember here, and that's the fact that any user that's a member of the administrators group on this system is already granted remote desktop access, even if they're not listed here. We could, however, add other users that aren't administrators if you want to. Click Add, and let's go ahead and add Rachel McGaffey. Click OK and OK again. So now we can log into this system remotely with either an administrator account or as Rachel McGaffey. Before we leave, I need to point out one other thing. Any user that you put into this list to allow remote desktop access must have a password assigned. If the user account doesn't have a password assigned, then you can't use it to authenticate to this local system via a remote desktop connection, even if that user is a member of the administrators group. So always remember, you must have a password assigned. All right, we'll hit OK, and now remote desktop access has been enabled on this system. Let's talk about remote desktop and firewalls for a minute. Remote desktop uses port 3389. When we enabled remote desktop, it automatically added an exception to our Windows firewall to allow remote desktop traffic. If we're going between two networks, you need to add a rule to your network firewall. If for some reason you have issues connecting, checking your firewalls would be a good place to start troubleshooting. So at this point, let's switch over to the other Windows 10 system, the one I normally use, and establish a remote desktop session with the remote system. Okay, I switched to the other system now. Let's come down to the search field on the Windows 10 system and type Remote Desktop. We'll click Desktop Connection from the search results. So the first thing we need to specify is the host name or IP address of the host that we want to connect to. The IP address of the remote Windows 10 we were just working on with is 192.168.0.172. Now at this point, I just click Connect. However, there are many remote connection options that we can configure. Let's click on Show Options here at the bottom. One of the things we can do is specify the name of the user that we want to connect to the other system as. If you leave this field blank, it's actually not that big of a deal. You'll just be prompted to provide a username and password on that remote system when you establish the connection. I'm going to leave that blank for now. Some systems will allow you to save your password here, but that's a security risk. Someone could potentially easily connect to a remote system if you happen to walk away from your desk for a few minutes. So even though it's convenient, it's not recommended. It's really best to require full authentication every time you connect. Let's go over to the Display tab. Here we can configure how big the remote desktop session will be on the desktop. Notice that by default, it's set to full screen, which means it will basically replace my local desktop. Sometimes that's a great way to do things. Other times it's not so convenient. Personally, I like to have it running in a window rather than full screen. So let's crank the resolution down just a little bit. We'll just do 1280 by 720 for our purposes here. You can also specify the color depth of the remote session. We're going to leave this set to the highest quality because we're on LAN segment with a gigabit connection between these two computers. But understand that the higher the color depth you use, the more network bandwidth will be required. If you're connecting over the internet, you can move that down if you like. Now let's go over the Local Resources tab. This allows us to specify the interaction between the hardware on my local machine here and the hardware installed in the remote machine. For example, we can configure remote audio settings. We can specify that when a sound is played on the remote computer, you can apply Windows key combinations here. Notice down here that there's a local device and resources that we can use in the remote session. I can be working on a document on the remote system and have it print through the remote session to the computer I'm sitting at. That's a very useful feature. Another feature is the ability to use the clipboard so I can copy, cut, and paste between the remote and local systems. Let's go down here and click More. Notice here that we have the option to share smart cards. We can share hardware ports. We can even share drives. If I expand drives, I can pick which drives will be accessible in the remote session. I'll hit Cancel here. Let's go over to the Experience tab. Be aware that a remote desktop connection does require a certain amount of network bandwidth, depending upon how many features of the remote desktop we want to be able to view locally. So what we need to do is specify how fast our network is, and then that will determine how many of these Windows desktop features we're going to be able to use through the remote desktop session. By default, this is set to detect connection quality automatically. If we click here, you can specify your type of connection. When you select one of these, Windows will turn features on and off to improve performance over slower connections. You can also tweak these settings if you like. I'm going to leave it to detect automatically. We have persistent bitmap caching. If this setting is checked, it creates a client-side cache of bitmaps that are rendered in the session. It helps with bandwidth, and it should always be enabled unless there are security concerns. Finally, down here, we have reconnect if the connection is dropped. If you have this option turned on and your connection gets dropped for whatever reason, the remote desktop connection client will automatically go out and reestablish that connection immediately. You may or may not have an advanced tab, depending on the system setup. There are additional settings here, and I'll just leave them set to the defaults. Let's go back to the General tab. If we wanted to, we could save this connection and use it for this particular connection every time we connect to it. We could do this for each of our remote systems that we connect to, depending on the different options we may have chosen previously. So now that we've looked at the various configuration options, let's go ahead and connect to the remote system. Click Connect. Let's try our John Schaefer account. I'll enter the password for the account. This account was not one of the accounts added as a remote desktop user, and it's not an administrator. Let's click OK and see what happens. Now we're prompted to accept the certificate from the remote computer. The reason we're being prompted is because we're not using a trusted certificate authority out on the internet. Instead, we're using our own locally minted certificates that were created when we first installed both of these computers. So basically, the remote desktop client is saying, hey, I don't know if this is a good certificate or not. Well, we know that it's fine. So I'm going to go ahead and say, don't ask me again for connections to this computer. So I click yes to accept it. You can see this dialog that tells me that we can't connect because the John Schaefer account isn't authorized for this remote login. That's what we expected. I'll click OK. Now let's try the Rachel McGaffey account along with the password. Rachel's account isn't an administrator either, but we add it as a remote desktop user. Let's click OK. When we connect, we'll get messages on both of the remote systems and the local system. If someone is logged into the remote system, they'll get a message letting them know that they're about to get kicked off. They won't be able to stay logged in when someone else remotes into the system. I'll go ahead and click on yes. Now on the remote system, that user is getting a message letting them know that I'm going to remote into that machine. Okay, we've connected to our remote system. When I'm done, I'll come down here to the start, click on the power button, and sign out. That's it for this demonstration. In this demo, we talked about how to establish a remote desktop connection. We talked about how to enable a remote desktop on a remote system that we want to connect to. And then we talked about how to configure our local remote desktop connection in order to connect to remote systems.